The war had already consumed years of their lives, from the muddy fields of France to the frozen forests of Russia. German soldiers had been conditioned to believe that capture by the enemy was worse than death. Propaganda, repeated endlessly by officers and pamphlets, told them that surrender was dishonorable, that Americans and British alike would strip them of dignity, starve them, and treat them as less than human. To fall into captivity was to invite humiliation, pain, and shame upon one's family. This belief followed every soldier onto the battlefield. Some swore they would use their final bullet on themselves rather than let an enemy touch them. Others whispered oaths that they would fight until their bodies gave out, collapsing in blood before yielding. Yet war does not always follow intentions. In the confusion of artillery fire, in the chaos of ambushes, in the fatigue of weeks without food, surrender sometimes came not as a choice, but as the only remaining path to survival. Prisoners were rounded up in groups, rifles pressed against their backs as they were marched away from the front. Some were still bleeding from wounds hastily bandaged. Others staggered with exhaustion. In their minds, captivity meant darkness. Rumors said prisoners were beaten in public squares. Others claimed they were left in cages without water. The weight of these stories crushed the spirits of those captured. When transport trains groaned into motion, carrying them across miles of American-controlled territory, fear deepened. Wooden boxcars held dozens of men, crowded shoulder to shoulder, staring through small slits in the boards at passing fields and towns. Nights were the hardest. Cold seeped through gaps in the planks. Men wrapped arms around themselves, whispering prayers, teeth chattering in the darkness. The smell of unwashed bodies mingled with sweat and fear. No one slept well. Each time the train stopped, the scrape of boots on gravel outside sent shivers down spines. Would this be the place of execution? Would they be forced into hard labor until they collapsed? Few dared to speak their thoughts aloud. Silence reigned, broken only by coughs and the shifting of feet. The strongest belief, rooted by years of instruction, was that Americans were merciless. Leaflets, circulated by German commanders, painted them as materialistic, decadent, and cruel. Soldiers were told that American strength came not from courage, but from machines, from factories, from wealth stolen from others. They were described as unable to fight with honor, reliant on brute force, and eager to mock and degrade their enemies. For young men raised on discipline and obedience, this image was both terrifying and insulting. It convinced them that surrender to such an enemy was a fate worse than death. So when the trains finally screeched to a halt, when the doors clanged open and sunlight streamed into the dark interior, the prisoners braced for brutality. Guards stood outside with rifles slung across their shoulders, bayonets glinting. Stern orders were barked in English, words unfamiliar yet sharp in tone. The men stumbled out, blinking against the light, boots crunching on gravel. Lines formed. Roll call began. Each man was registered, his name written down, his details recorded. The procedure felt mechanical, precise. It was not what they expected. No clubs struck them. No fists landed. The guards were firm, rifles always at the ready, but the violence they had feared did not arrive. The march toward the camp was equally unsettling. Rows of prisoners shuffled along, surrounded by armed escorts. They passed through roads where local civilians sometimes stared in silence, curiosity etched on their faces. Whispers carried through the ranks. Why were the people not spitting at them? Why did no stones fly toward them? For men who had been told that hatred would greet them, the quiet of American towns felt stranger than hostility. When the camp gates came into view, fear surged again. High fences, crowned with barbed wire, stood before them. Guard towers loomed, silhouettes of soldiers visible against the sky. Searchlights waited to sweep the grounds. Yet, as the gates creaked open and they stepped inside, confusion returned. The grounds were orderly, barracks stretched in neat rows, their wooden structures intact and freshly painted. Gravel paths marked walkways, signs directed men to mess halls, infirmaries, and storage facilities. This did not resemble the cages of their imagination. It resembled, in some uncanny way, a military training ground. And then came the shock that none had anticipated. Blankets. As men filed into barracks, folded woolen blankets were issued, each stamped with markings of property. The guards handed them out without ceremony, as though it were the most natural act in the world. Prisoners clutched the fabric in disbelief. Some pressed it against their chests, waiting for the cruel joke to reveal itself. Surely this was temporary. Surely punishment would follow. But no. That night, when the cold air settled across the compound, the prisoners wrapped themselves in the wool and felt warmth for the first time in weeks. The blanket became the first symbol of contradiction. To men raised on propaganda that spoke of merciless enemies, the softness of cloth was bewildering. It was not luxury. The wool was rough, the weave coarse, yet it kept the cold at bay. It whispered of survival. In that moment, many prisoners realized that their captivity would not unfold as they had imagined. There would be rules, there would be order, but there would also be a strange kind of care. That first night in the barracks etched itself into memory. Rows of men lay in silence, the faint rustle of blankets breaking the stillness. Some whispered prayers of thanks, others wept quietly, overwhelmed by the contrast between expectation and reality. The scent of wool, faint and earthy, filled the room. For men who had not known comfort for months, it was as if a barrier had been broken. The enemy was not cruel in the ways they had been warned. The enemy was disciplined, organized, and bound by law. This realization carried weight far beyond that first night. In later years, when men recounted their captivity, they often returned to this moment. The shock of being handed a blanket by a guard who spoke no German, but followed procedure with unwavering precision, remained etched in their minds. It was the moment when propaganda crumbled and reality intruded. It was the moment when survival seemed possible. The hook of this story lies not in violence, not in dramatic escape, but in the small detail of wool passed from one hand to another. It is here that the true contrast of war reveals itself. Propaganda had painted the Americans as cruel conquerors. Reality showed them as captors bound by regulations, offering warmth even as they enforced imprisonment. For German prisoners, this contradiction would define the years that followed. The blanket was not freedom, it was not home, but it was proof that humanity could survive even behind wire. And in the years ahead, that proof would matter more than they could have ever imagined. The march from the railway to the camp was silent except for the crunch of boots on gravel. German prisoners, shoulders hunched, eyes darting, followed the commands of guards who spoke in clipped English. The rifles carried by those guards were constant reminders that they were no longer soldiers, but captives. Fear weighed heavily on every step. In their minds, arrival meant the beginning of humiliation. They had been told that once the gates closed behind them, all dignity would vanish. The camp loomed ahead. Wooden watchtowers stood like stern sentinels against the horizon. Barbed wire gleamed in the sunlight, coiled and sharp, wrapping the perimeter in cruel spirals. From a distance, the sight confirmed their fears. This was a prison. There would be no escape, no reprieve. Yet as they approached, new details came into focus. The gates were not ragged or rusted. They were well built, straight, and orderly. The grounds inside looked strangely neat. Barracks lined up in rows, their wooden planks freshly nailed, roofs intact, gravel paths cut between them with precision. For men who had just left behind the shattered landscapes of Europe, this order was disorienting. Crossing the threshold brought a new kind of tension. The gates shut with a heavy clang, sealing them inside. Guards directed them into lines. Each man's name was called, recorded, and checked against documents. Numbers were assigned. Paperwork was stamped. This mechanical process surprised them. There was no wild shouting, no beatings. The guards were strict, but they acted more like clerks than tormentors. The enemy seemed to value efficiency above cruelty. Inside the barracks, more shocks awaited. Instead of straw on the floor or bare ground, wooden bunks stretched along the walls. On each bunk lay a thin mattress, and at the foot of each bed, folded blankets waited. The wool was coarse, marked with official letters, but to men who had marched through frozen fields without comfort, it seemed almost luxurious. They had braced for stone floors and rags. Instead, they were given beds. Whispers filled the room as prisoners exchanged glances, uncertain whether to trust what they saw. The smell of soap lingered faintly in the air. It came from laundry facilities nearby, though the prisoners did not yet know that. To them, the scent was both alien and familiar. It reminded them of homes left behind, of mothers washing clothes, of linens dried in village courtyards. The memory struck deep, stirring emotions they had tried to bury during years of war. Some men looked down quickly, ashamed of the tears forming in their eyes. To feel nostalgia in the enemy's barracks was a confusion they could not untangle. The first meal inside the camp added to their astonishment. Instead of starvation rations, they were given trays of warm food, bread with butter, coffee steaming in tin cups, meat in portions larger than they had expected. Many stared at the trays in disbelief before daring to eat. Some feared poison, others feared it was a trick, a kindness followed by cruelty. Yet hunger was stronger than suspicion. Slowly, carefully, they ate, and in eating, they felt a spark of strength return to their bodies. The guards remained present, rifles visible, eyes alert. They enforced silence during the meal, moving along the aisles with firm steps. The prisoners watched them closely, waiting for sudden violence. But the guards did not strike. They gave orders. They maintained discipline. They enforced rules. Still, there was no humiliation. This rigid control was unsettling. For soldiers trained to expect brutality, the absence of it felt strange. Some whispered that the real punishment would come later. Others began to wonder if captivity in America might be different than the horror stories they had heard. Night fell, and with it came the first test of the blankets. The air outside grew sharp with cold, seeping through cracks in the barrack walls. Men pulled the wool around themselves, feeling its weight. The fabric scratched against skin, rough but solid. For the first time in weeks, many slept through the night without shivering. The simple act of lying beneath a blanket became a revelation. It was survival disguised as comfort. It was mercy delivered through cloth, and it was impossible to ignore. The next morning revealed the rules of order. Prisoners were lined up outside their barracks. Inspections began. Guards walked the rows, checking uniforms, checking bunks, and checking blankets. Each blanket had to be folded neatly at the foot of the bed, corners aligned. Any mistake drew correction, sometimes stern words, sometimes extra duties. This ritual introduced the prisoners to a truth they would soon learn well. In America, captivity was not chaos, it was routine. Every act was regulated, every day carried a schedule. Blankets were not only comfort, they were also discipline. This first impression planted seeds that would grow in the minds of the prisoners. The enemy did not break them with whips or starvation. The enemy controlled them with order, with rules, with the weight of regulation. The blankets symbolized that control. They warmed bodies, but they also reminded men that survival came at the price of obedience. For some, this was unsettling. For others, it was a strange relief. After years of improvisation in collapsing German garrisons, where food was scarce and clothing disintegrated, order itself felt like luxury. The contrast could not have been sharper. The battlefield had been chaos. The camp was clockwork. In later years, many prisoners would remember their arrival as the most bewildering moment of captivity. They had stepped through the gates expecting cruelty and found a world defined by rules and routines. They had expected to be stripped of dignity and instead found themselves inspected for cleanliness. They had expected only suffering and instead were handed blankets. These first impressions remained etched in their memories for decades. The arrival revealed a paradox that haunted them long after the war. How could an enemy capable of dropping bombs on their cities also hand them wool for warmth? How could a nation so powerful in battle choose to display discipline instead of cruelty behind the wire? The contradiction unsettled their beliefs, forcing them to see that war was not always what propaganda had promised. The blankets were the first lesson. They were also the first reminder that captivity would be defined not by chaos, but by order. For German prisoners who had braced for humiliation, that realization was as shocking as any weapon fired on the battlefield. If you believe history should be remembered with respect, subscribe to War Secrets Unveiled today. The first days inside the camp passed in a blur of orders, inspections, and routines. What shocked the German prisoners most was not cruelty, but the relentless structure of their new lives. Each day began with the blast of a whistle. At dawn, guards ordered them out of bed, lined them up in neat rows, and marched them to roll call. Attendance was taken with precision. Numbers were checked and cross-checked. Every absence was noted. The discipline was firm, mechanical, and unyielding. After roll call came the ritual of the barracks inspection. Blankets had to be folded into perfect squares at the foot of each bunk. Beds had to be made with corners, sharp as if cut by a blade. Boots had to be placed in line beneath bunks. Guards walked slowly between the rows, eyes sweeping over every detail. A blanket left wrinkled or misaligned drew stern words or extra duties. For men who had come from collapsing German units, where chaos and improvisation ruled, this new emphasis on order was both humiliating and strangely reassuring. Captivity was not chaos, captivity was schedule. Meals followed. In the mess hall, prisoners carried tin trays down long lines where food was served by fellow captives assigned to kitchen duty. Bread, coffee, potatoes, sometimes meat. The rations were plain but filling. For many, it was the first time in months that they had eaten without fear of running out. In the field, hunger had been constant. Soldiers had gnawed on stale crusts, scraped the bottoms of empty tins, and gone to bed with empty stomachs. Here, food arrived at regular times. It was simple, but it was reliable. The certainty of meals became a quiet comfort. After breakfast, work assignments began. Some prisoners were sent to maintain campgrounds. Others worked in kitchens, laundries, or tailoring shops. Those with skills in carpentry or mechanics were put to use repairing tools and equipment. The work kept bodies moving and prevented idleness from breeding unrest. Yet even within labor, the rhythm of routine dominated. Shifts began at set hours, ended at set hours, and were monitored with the same precision as roll call. Recreation was also part of camp life. Sports fields allowed prisoners to play soccer or baseball. Libraries offered English books and magazines. Some camps even provided instruments for music. At first, many prisoners resisted these activities, suspicious that they were tricks meant to weaken resolve. Yet, as weeks turned into months, men began to participate. A soccer match on a dusty field, or the sound of a harmonica in a barrack, brought moments of distraction from the reality of captivity. Routine slowly shaped existence into something survivable, but it was the presence of blankets that made the greatest difference in the rhythm of daily life. Every night, prisoners returned to barracks, where folded blankets awaited them. The wool was scratchy, sometimes patched, but it was warm. In the cold of American winters, it was life itself. Men began to treat their blankets with care, folding them as required in the morning, shaking them out before sleep, sometimes trading them with others for ones in better condition. The blanket became not just fabric, but a companion, a symbol of continuity in an otherwise foreign world. Memories of home clung to those blankets. The smell of wool reminded men of their childhood beds. The act of tucking cloth around their shoulders stirred visions of mothers smoothing quilts over them in distant villages. Some prisoners whispered stories of home at night, speaking quietly so guards would not hear. They spoke of wives and children, of houses now lost, of mornings when blankets were lifted away by loved ones rather than by whistles and guards. These conversations filled the barracks with a quiet ache, the ache of memory colliding with present reality. The contrast was stark. On the battlefield, men had lived without comfort, often sleeping on mud or snow. In captivity, they slept under blankets. On the battlefield, food had been uncertain, scraped together from what little could be scavenged. In captivity, meals came at scheduled times. On the battlefield, days blurred into endless survival. In captivity, days were broken into routines that repeated with almost military elegance. For men who had braced themselves for torture, the structure of captivity was a revelation, yet routine carried its own form of control. Guards understood that order kept the camp stable. The folded blankets at the foot of every bed were not only about cleanliness, they were symbols of authority. To follow the rule was to accept discipline. To resist was to invite punishment. Over time, prisoners learned that compliance brought small comforts. Resistance brought only trouble. Slowly, grudgingly, most accepted the rhythm of captivity. The emotional weight of this adjustment cannot be overstated. Soldiers raised in a culture that glorified sacrifice and endurance now lived in an environment where obedience meant folding a blanket neatly, lining up at the sound of a whistle, and eating meals at appointed hours. It was captivity, but it was captivity wrapped in order. Some found relief in this, others felt shame. To accept routine from the enemy was to admit dependence. And dependence, for men trained to fight without surrender, was a bitter truth. Still, memory softened resistance. At night, when men lay beneath blankets, they remembered homes once filled with warmth and comfort. They remembered mothers who scolded them for leaving beds unmade, wives who had folded sheets with careful hands, children who had snuggled beneath quilts. These memories mingled with the present, blurring the line between captivity and home. The blanket became a bridge between two worlds. On one side lay the battlefield, on the other side, the memory of peace. The rhythm of daily life reshaped identity. Prisoners who had entered the camp as soldiers began to feel like men again. Clean clothes replaced tattered uniforms. Blankets replaced mud. Regular meals replaced hunger. In this rhythm, they rediscovered fragments of humanity. They were still captives, still watched by guards, still far from home, but they were also alive. And in being alive, they found dignity in places they had never expected. The paradox of routine haunted them long after the war. Years later, when former prisoners spoke of their captivity, they often described the strange comfort of schedules. They remembered the relief of knowing when the next meal would come, of knowing that blankets awaited them at night. They remembered inspections and roll calls, the frustration of strict rules, but also the stability those rules provided. They remembered how the camp's order contrasted with the collapse of their own army, where shortages and chaos had ruled. For many, this contrast reshaped how they thought about strength. Perhaps, they realized, strength was not only in endurance of suffering, perhaps it was also in the ability to maintain order, even in times of conflict. Daily life in the camp was not freedom. It was not peace. It was a life stripped of choice, but it was also not the brutality they had expected. It was a life defined by blankets, folded, meals served, work completed, and inspections passed. It was survival through structure, and survival, in the end, was enough. Among all the objects that defined captivity, none carried the same weight of memory as the blanket. It was ordinary in appearance, a coarse square of wool, stamped with letters that declared it property of the camp. Yet for German prisoners who had arrived convinced that they would face cruelty and humiliation, the blanket became something far greater than fabric. It was warmth against cold nights. It was order in a world that had been reduced to chaos. It was a reminder of home and an anchor of identity when everything else had been stripped away. The first night under those blankets became a turning point. Men who had trembled with fear as they marched through the gates now lay in bunks, clutching wool to their bodies. The scratch of the fabric against skin was real. The weight of it pressed down on them, heavy and reassuring. In that moment, many realized that they would live. They would not be left to freeze on bare boards. They would not be abandoned to despair. Survival had come in the form of rough wool. Blankets soon took on lives of their own inside the camp. Each man guarded his carefully. They were folded every morning for inspection, corners aligned to military precision. Guards checked them as if they were symbols of discipline. But beyond regulation, the blanket carried meaning for the prisoners themselves. Some treated them with almost sacred care, folding them slowly, smoothing every wrinkle, making sure they were clean. Others carried them like personal shields, draped around shoulders when allowed, clutched close during moments of fear. At night, the blanket became more than protection against cold. It became a bridge to memory. A prisoner might pull the wool up to his chin and suddenly recall his childhood bed in a quiet German village. He might see his mother shaking out linens by a fire. He might hear his wife's voice calling children to sleep. For a brief moment, the barracks disappeared. In its place stood the memory of home. This connection was fragile, yet powerful. It reminded men that they were still human, still part of families, still capable of love. Some men began to personalize their blankets in secret. They stitched small marks into corners with thread pulled from uniforms, a simple cross, a set of initials, a tiny pattern. These marks were invisible to guards, but deeply meaningful to those who made them. They transformed a piece of camp property into something personal, something that carried identity in a place where individuality was stripped away. Blankets also carried unspoken power within the barracks. A man with a clean and intact blanket seemed stronger, more resilient. A man whose blanket was torn or filthy looked defeated. Prisoners traded blankets secretly, bartering with cigarettes, extra bread, or favors. A blanket in good condition could be as valuable as food. It was warmth, dignity, and status wrapped into one. There were moments when the symbolism of the blanket became overwhelming. In winter, when snow piled outside the barracks and frost crept along windows, men lay side by side, each wrapped in wool. Silence hung heavy, broken only by coughs and shifting bodies. In that silence, the blanket was more than survival. It was a reminder that even in defeat, life continued. The warmth of cloth against skin proved that the enemy did not intend to let them die. It proved that order, not cruelty, governed captivity. This realization shook many to their core. For some, the blanket stirred guilt. They asked themselves if it was right to take comfort from the enemy, to lie in warmth while comrades lay frozen in trenches across the ocean seemed a betrayal. Officers sometimes whispered warnings. Do not grow soft. Do not mistake this wool for kindness. Yet even the most stubborn felt the pull of warmth when night fell. Survival demanded acceptance, and in that acceptance, the blanket became both salvation and shame. Blankets were also tied to rituals of control. Guards inspected them during roll call. They checked that each was folded to regulation. They checked for cleanliness. A poorly folded blanket could earn punishment. In this way, blankets became instruments of discipline. The enemy maintained control, not through whips, but through wool. Each fold was obedience. Each inspection was submission. Prisoners learned quickly that survival meant keeping corners square and fabric clean. Over time, the blanket grew into a paradox. It symbolized both captivity and humanity. It was a mark of being controlled, yet also a mark of being cared for. It represented loss of freedom and the preservation of life at the same time. For prisoners caught in this contradiction, the blanket became an object of deep psychological power. They could not decide whether to hate it or to cherish it, so they did both. Diaries, written years later, show how deeply the blanket shaped memory. Men who could not recall details of battles could recall the texture of wool. They could describe the smell of detergent after laundry day. They could remember the sting of cold nights made bearable by fabric. These details returned again and again in testimonies. The blanket had become the lens through which they understood captivity. One former prisoner wrote that he could still feel the weight of the blanket on his chest decades later. He remembered lying awake, staring at the wooden beams of the barracks, listening to the breathing of dozens of men around him, and clutching the blanket like a lifeline. He remembered that in those moments, he realized he would survive, not because of his strength, not because of his will, but because the enemy had chosen to give him warmth. Another recalled how the act of folding his blanket each morning became a ritual of endurance. He smoothed the corners, not for the guards, but for himself. It was a way of proving that he still cared, that he still had discipline, that he still lived as more than a defeated soldier. In that fold, he reclaimed fragments of dignity. The blanket was not luxury. It was not freedom. It was survival reduced to its simplest form. Yet in its simplicity lay its power. It taught prisoners that life could continue through small mercies. It taught them that dignity could survive through routines. It reminded them that humanity, though fragile, was not destroyed by captivity. For German prisoners in American camps, the blanket became the most enduring symbol of their experience. It was fabric, yet it was also memory, order, survival, and contradiction woven together. It was the shock that defined arrival and the anchor that carried them through years of captivity. Long after the war, when they spoke of what had sustained them, many mentioned not food, not medicine, not even freedom. They mentioned the blanket, and in that choice, the true weight of its symbolism became clear. Captivity was survival, but it was not without torment. The torment did not come only from barbed wire, guards, or loss of freedom. It came from within. It came from the weight of belief that clashed with reality. German prisoners had been raised in a culture that preached sacrifice above comfort. They had been told that to suffer in silence was proof of loyalty. They had been warned that surrender was dishonor. Yet, inside the American camps, they were forced to live with contradictions that tore at their identity. The blanket was the clearest symbol of this struggle. At night, when men pulled wool across their shoulders, they felt warmth that kept death away. In that warmth, they felt relief. Yet at the same time, guilt crept into their thoughts. How could a soldier who had sworn allegiance to the fatherland take comfort from the enemy? How could a man who had promised to fight to the end lie in safety beneath cloth given by those he had been told to hate? The blanket was survival, but it was also shame. Officers inside the camps carried the burden most heavily. For them, the collapse of hierarchy was unbearable. In Germany, their uniforms had marked them as leaders. Their insignia had demanded obedience. In captivity, blankets erased those distinctions. Officers and enlisted men slept side by side, wrapped in the same wool, subject to the same inspections. Some officers whispered warnings to their men. Do not be fooled by the enemy's routines. Do not mistake blankets for kindness. Do not grow weak. They feared that order disguised as mercy would erode the discipline that had once defined their army. Yet soldiers listened with divided hearts. Hunger was gone. Cold was bearable. Routines replaced chaos. Many began to feel that adaptation was the only path to survival. They folded their blankets as ordered, lined up for meals, and followed camp schedules. But each act carried a sting of doubt. Was compliance survival or betrayal? Was folding a blanket obedience to the enemy or obedience to life itself? These questions haunted them. Religion deepened the crisis for some. Men who carried prayer books or whispered psalms at night found themselves struggling with moral contradiction. Were they meant to accept care from enemies? Was the warmth of a blanket a gift from God or a trick of captors? Some prayed for forgiveness, asking to be spared the shame of comfort. Others prayed in gratitude, believing that survival, no matter its source, was sacred. Faith did not erase doubt, it magnified it. Dreams became battlegrounds of the mind. At night, men dreamed of home. They saw wives folding linens. They saw children curled beneath quilts. They awoke with blankets around their shoulders and for a moment felt safe. Then the realization struck. These were not the blankets of home. They were the blankets of captivity. The line between memory and reality blurred, and shame mingled with longing. Letters from home, when they arrived, sharpened the struggle. A wife might write of hardship, of cold winters without enough coal, of children sleeping under thin covers. The prisoner who read such words did so while sitting on a bunk beneath American wool. The guilt was crushing. He was warm while his family froze. He was fed while they starved. The blanket became a reminder not only of captivity, but of distance from those he loved. Shame spread in silence. Few spoke openly of it. To admit it aloud was to confess weakness, yet silence did not erase the feeling. It lingered in the way men avoided eye contact during inspections. It lingered in the hesitation before pulling blankets tight at night. It lingered in the whispers officers used to warn their men not to forget the ideals of endurance. The doubt extended beyond blankets. It touched every part of camp life. To eat food provided by Americans was to admit dependence. To accept medical care from American doctors was to admit vulnerability. To shave with American razors, to wear American issued uniforms, to live by American schedules, was to admit that the enemy had power not only over bodies, but over daily existence. Each act was survival, yet each act was also a surrender of pride. The crisis of belief fractured men in different ways. Some clung fiercely to old ideals, refusing to adapt. They left blankets poorly folded, rejected hygiene rules, or spoke openly of escape. For them, to comply was to betray. Others bent quietly, adapting to the new routines, convincing themselves that survival justified compromise. They folded blankets neatly, ate without hesitation, and even participated in camp sports or work assignments. But inside, doubt gnawed at them. Time did not heal the crisis, it deepened it. The longer captivity continued, the harder it became to reconcile propaganda with reality. Men had been told that America was merciless, yet they were alive, clothed, and warm. They had been told that surrender meant degradation, yet they still had dignity, though bound by rules. This contradiction forced them to question not only the enemy, but their own leaders who had lied to them. For some, this doubt was unbearable. It fractured their faith in the very values they had been raised with. Years later, when these men returned home, the crisis did not vanish. It followed them into conversations with family, into the silence of their own reflections. Some never spoke of it, ashamed to admit that they had survived by accepting blankets from the enemy. Others confessed quietly in memoirs, describing the guilt of pulling wool across their shoulders while comrades died far away. The blanket became the lasting symbol of doubt. It had saved them, yet it had also forced them to confront shame. Captivity was survival, but it was also a battlefield of belief. German prisoners wrestled with questions of loyalty, honor, and dignity every time they touched the coarse wool of their blankets. And in that struggle, they discovered that the hardest fight was not against guards or fences, it was against themselves. When the gates finally opened, many prisoners stepped outside not as soldiers, but as men remade by captivity. Years behind barbed wire had stripped away uniforms, ranks, and illusions. What remained was memory, and memory was heavy. The surrender itself had been sudden. Orders arrived from American officers that camps would begin releasing men in waves. Some prisoners did not believe it. They suspected another deception. Others felt relief so sharp it brought tears they tried to hide. To leave captivity was to reclaim freedom, yet freedom was no longer simple. The years inside had carved wounds that did not show on the body. For many, the moment of release was anticlimactic. Trucks rolled to the gates, names were read, blankets folded and returned. Prisoners marched out in lines once more, but this time not under guard rifles aimed at their backs. Some carried small bundles of possessions, a tin cup, a prayer book, a worn piece of cloth that had once been a blanket. The objects of captivity clung to them as quietly as scars. Return to Germany revealed a landscape as shattered as their beliefs. Cities lay in ruins. Families had endured years of bombing, hunger, and fear. Men who had lived with order in American camps now returned to chaos. Some found their homes gone. Others found loved ones lost. The contrast was jarring. For years, they had eaten meals by schedule, slept under blankets, and lived by rules. Now they faced a Germany where food was scarce, homes were rubble, and rules meant survival by improvisation. Memories of captivity complicated every reunion. A wife might ask about life in the camps. A husband might hesitate before answering. Should he speak of blankets and order? Should he confess that he had been warm while she had been cold? Should he admit that the enemy had preserved his life with routines that sometimes felt kinder than the desperation of home? Many chose silence. Silence protected dignity. Silence avoided shame. But silence also buried truths that weighed heavily in the quiet hours of night. The blanket returned in memory again and again. Men remembered its scratch, its warmth, its weight. Some confessed that they had slept better in captivity than in the ruins of post-war Germany. They hated themselves for such thoughts, yet memory could not be controlled. The blanket had become the symbol of contradiction. It was both comfort and captivity, both survival and shame. In towns and villages, former prisoners were sometimes met with suspicion. Neighbors asked why they had lived while others had died. Some accused them of weakness, of surrender, of dishonor. The men carried no easy defense. They had lived because the enemy had chosen to let them live. They had lived because blankets had been issued, food had been served, order had been enforced. For those who had been taught that endurance meant suffering without relief, survival through order felt like betrayal. Not all memories were bitter. Some men spoke quietly of gratitude. They admitted that without the routines of captivity, they would not have survived. They admitted that blankets, meals, and inspections had preserved their health. Yet even in gratitude, there was unease. Gratitude toward the enemy felt dangerous. Gratitude toward those who had bombed their cities felt impossible to reconcile. The contradiction lingered for decades. As years passed, testimonies began to emerge. Diaries kept in secret were published. Oral histories were recorded. Again and again, former prisoners spoke not of battles, but of daily life in captivity. They spoke of the first time they touched a blanket after months of marching in cold. They spoke of the first night they slept without shivering. They spoke of the strange dignity that came from folded wool. Historians who read these accounts noticed how frequently blankets appeared in memory. They became shorthand for the paradox of captivity. The aftermath was not only personal, it was also cultural. For Germany, the war had been lost. The myth of invincibility had collapsed. The experience of prisoners, returning with stories of American order and discipline, challenged the propaganda of the past. They had been told the enemy was cruel. They had seen that the enemy was efficient, regulated, and sometimes humane. This knowledge unsettled old beliefs. It forced a reckoning not just with defeat, but with the lies that had sustained the war. Some former prisoners rebuilt lives in silence, never speaking of captivity again. They worked in factories, raised families, and avoided the subject. Others told their children small fragments, a memory of coffee in tin cups, a memory of blankets folded at the foot of bunks. These fragments seemed trivial to outsiders, but to the men who lived them, they were the essence of survival. Even decades later, the memory of surrender carried layers of emotion: relief at having lived, guilt at having accepted care, shame at having surrendered, nostalgia for the order of captivity in contrast to the chaos of post war Germany. The aftermath was not clean, it was tangled, it was filled with contradictions that could not be untied. The legacy of those blankets lingered in the quiet spaces of memory. A man might walk into his home, see his wife fold a quilt, and suddenly recall the weight of wool in a barrack. He might sit by a fire, hear the crackle, and remember the silence of men wrapped in blankets on cold nights in America. These memories did not fade. They lived on as part of identity, shaping how former prisoners understood war, survival, and themselves. The surrender freed bodies, but not minds. The return ended captivity, but not contradiction. In the aftermath, German prisoners discovered that the hardest part of survival was not the camp itself. It was living with the memories of blankets, rules, and routines that had preserved life while reshaping belief. The war ended, but captivity did not fade from memory. For the men who had lived behind wire in America, the experience of blankets, routines, and order followed them long after the gates had opened. Decades passed, yet the legacy of those years remained, shaping how they thought of the enemy, of themselves, and of survival. In post war Germany, silence wrapped around former prisoners. Few spoke openly of their time in American camps. Families asked questions, but answers came in fragments. A man might say only that he had been fed, or that conditions were bearable. Rarely did he describe the blankets folded at the foot of bunks, the smell of soap in laundry rooms, or the strange discipline of inspections. These details felt too strange, too shameful, too far from the propaganda that had promised cruelty. To admit them was to confess that the enemy had preserved life through order rather than destroyed it through violence. Yet silence did not erase memory. In the quiet of their homes, men remembered. They remembered the feel of wool across shoulders. They remembered the rhythm of folding blankets each morning. They remembered the contradiction of finding dignity in obedience to the enemy's rules. These memories became part of their private identity, shaping how they understood discipline, survival, and humanity. As Germany rebuilt, the legacy of captivity influenced daily choices. Some men became devoted to order, believing that structure was the key to endurance. They taught their children the value of routines, of cleanliness, of folded clothes and tidy rooms. Others rejected order, haunted by the memory of rules that had been used to control them. For them, the blanket was not comfort, but a reminder of submission. The legacy split men in different directions, yet it never left them entirely. Historians later recorded testimonies that revealed the power of these memories. When asked about battles, many former prisoners hesitated. Details of gunfire, mud, and chaos blurred over time. But when asked about captivity, the answers sharpened. They could describe the exact texture of a blanket, the weight of wool, the sound of American guards calling roll, the smell of coffee poured into tin cups. Memory clung to these small details because they carried the weight of contradiction. The legacy also extended to reconciliation. When Germany and the United States rebuilt relations in the decades after the war, stories of humane treatment in camps quietly softened hostility. Former prisoners who had once expected cruelty but found blankets instead spoke of the shock of American order. They admitted that this experience had challenged their beliefs about the enemy. These admissions did not erase the bitterness of defeat, but they planted seeds of respect, seeds that grew as both nations sought new partnerships in a world reshaped by peace. For some, the legacy of captivity became part of personal writings, diaries smuggled from camps, notebooks hidden in folds of clothing, or later memoirs published for families. All carried the same recurring symbol, the blanket. It appeared again and again, not as luxury, not as freedom, but as the paradox of captivity itself. The object was simple, yet its meaning was vast. It symbolized life preserved, dignity reshaped, and belief unsettled. The impact reached even further. Younger generations, reading these accounts decades later, began to understand that war was not only battles, it was also the quiet endurance of men behind wire. It was also blankets, folded and inspected. It was also coffee poured into cups by enemies. This understanding expanded the narrative of war beyond victory and defeat into the realm of human survival. The blanket as symbol outlived the camps. Some men kept pieces of them, cut secretly before release, a scrap of wool hidden in luggage, a square stitched into a coat lining. These relics were carried home like silent talismans. Wives sometimes discovered them years later and asked why they had been kept. The answer was often a shrug or silence, but the truth was deeper. These scraps were not fabric, they were memory. They were proof of survival in a world where survival had seemed impossible. In international discussions of the Geneva Convention, testimonies from prisoners were sometimes cited. Reports confirmed that order, hygiene, and provision in camps had preserved lives. The image of prisoners sleeping beneath blankets became part of a larger narrative about the responsibilities of nations in war, though not all camps in all nations followed such rules. The American model influenced how captivity was remembered in history books and classrooms. The legacy was not only personal, it was historical. Decades after the war, reunions of former prisoners brought these memories to the surface again. Men who had once lain in rows of bunks under identical blankets now sat at tables with coffee cups, older, quieter, but still remembering. They told each other stories they had not told their families. They laughed about the strictness of inspections. They nodded in silence about the guilt of comfort. They shared the legacy of captivity with those who understood it most. As age advanced, many wrote their final reflections. They spoke of the paradox of the blanket. It was both humiliation and salvation, both control and dignity, both enemy property and personal survival. They admitted that they had never fully resolved the contradiction, yet they also admitted that the memory of warmth on cold nights had sustained them not only during the war, but also through the struggles of post war life. The legacy of captivity was not triumph. It was not pride. It was survival marked by paradox. It was memory carried in silence, revealed in fragments, etched into identity. The blanket symbolized that legacy most of all. Ordinary wool, stamped with letters, folded at the foot of bunks, became the most enduring memory of an extraordinary contradiction. For German prisoners who had expected cruelty but found blankets in America, the impact stretched across decades. It shaped how they lived, how they remembered, and how they taught their children about war. It softened enmity, complicated belief, and forced recognition that even in the darkest times, survival could come from the most unexpected sources. In the end, the blanket remained, not in fabric, which wore away, not in possession, which was left behind, but in memory, which outlived war, captivity, and even the men themselves. The blanket became the lasting legacy, proof that survival was woven not only through endurance, but through the quiet mercy of order.